Hello, learners. I welcome you to the fifth lecture of week 3 in the course Environmental Politics, Theories, Concepts, and Debates. In this week, we are discussing environmental movements at the global level. Today, we will discuss the topic Gender and Race in Environmental Movements with a special reference to environmental justice movement in America and green belt movement in Kenya. So basic objective of this lecture is to understand that what role gender, race, class play in shaping the experiences of environmental degradation. So earlier also I said that it is true that environmental degradation impacts everyone, but it doesn't impact everyone equally. This experience and impact of environmental degradation varies in terms of class, race, gender, and so on. So, to understand these experiences and how it is shaped by gender, race, class, we can adopt the approach of intersectionality given by Crenshaw, where she says that unique experiences of privileges as well as marginalization are created when the categories of class, race, gender, and sexual orientation intersect. So, to understand this phenomena, we will mainly focus on environmental justice movement in America and green belt movement in Kenya. You see, these two movements are very, very different from each other in terms of issues, strategies, and even the context. We can say that the environmental justice movement mainly represent brown agenda, whereas the green belt movement represents a green agenda. But even then, we have chosen these two movements to discuss together because it would help us to understand that what role is played by gender, race, class, and these kind of social categories in shaping the experiences of environmental degradation. So this is the outline of the lecture. We are going to cover these aspects. We'll begin with the concept of intersectionality. So till now we have examined the phenomena of impact of environmental degradation on human life in the context of anthropocentric versus ecocentric perspective. And we have understood that anthropocentric perspective keeps humans at the center, prefers their interest over the interest of other inhabitants of ecosphere. But there is a need to dissect this category of humans. Why? Because they are divided on various grounds like race, gender, class. And therefore, their relation with environment cannot be understood overlooking these divisions. And here comes the role of intersectionality. It is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in her paper titled Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. She wrote this paper in 1989 and she coined this term and concept to describe how unique experiences of discrimination and privilege are created when different social categories like race, class, gender, and sexual orientation intersect. Basically, she developed this approach to explain and examine Black women's experiences of discrimination, which are shaped by this intersection of gender and race. So, to put this in a very simple term, we can say that when you see Black women's position from this approach of intersectionality, you'd find that it is true that uh, women in a patriarchal setup are marginalized and oppressed. But when you see the position of Black women, you will find that uh, their experiences of this operation is different. Why? Because it emanates from two sources, gender and race. So we can say women are oppressed, but the operation of black women is different from operation of other category of women. So this is how we can see a phenomena from intersectional approach. And now when we look at the experiences of marginal groups like black women, Latino Asian women, third world women, black men, in the environmental crisis, then we find that the impact of environmental degradation and also benefits and burdens of the so-called development are not equally distributed. And this complex experience can be understood through an intersectional approach. And here we will be talking about two major movements, as I said in the beginning only. One is the environmental justice movement in America, and second is Green Belt movement in Kenya. So to begin with environmental justice movement in America, you see some of the aspect of environmental justice we discussed when we were talking about the concept of environmental justice. So this whole debate on environmental justice started from the United States somewhere in 1970s and then spread in the other parts of the globe. So some major protests by the non-white communities in America against unequal burden of environmental degradation and development projects were protest of the residents of West Harlem, New York against the sewage treatment plant in their community in 1968. Then in 1979, there was a protest of black residents of Northwood Manor in East Houston against placing of a garbage dump in their neighborhood. And the most strong voice for the cause of environmental justice emerged from Warren County, North Carolina. So we'll see what was this Warren County case and what was the movement and what was its impact. So, in the late 1970s, the state of North Carolina it was deliberating that where it could store 6,000 truckloads of soil mixed with toxic PCBs. That was a toxic chemical. And finally, it decided to place it in a predominantly African American community in Warren County by constructing a toxic waste landfill. When the local resident came to know about that, they got furious, and this led to furious protest by the blacks, like 6 weeks of marches, non-violent street protest, and more than 500 arrests in 1982. And the protest initially was launched by the resident of Warren County, but it drew national attention and later on joined by many veterans of civil rights movement like Dr. Benjamin F. Chavis, Joseph Lowery, and many more. One very important name was Walter Fauntroy, who was at that time the congressional delegate from District of Columbia and chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. He also joined the protest. And those activists who were participating in the protest, they uh, they observed a clear pattern. And what was that pattern? That the corporations, regulatory agencies, and local planning and zoning boards were choosing the locality inhabited by low income communities of color for setting polluting facilities like landfills, waste transfer stations, garbage dumps, and so on. So you can see two things are important: low income and communities of color. So, class and race. Walter Fauntroy, when he came back from the protest, so he gave the task of examining the impacts of the construction of hazardous waste landfills on communities of color and to check whether these communities of color suffered disproportionately. to the General Accounting Office. Now, when General Accounting Office conducted the study, the report was very alarming. It gave its report in 3. The title of the report was Sitting of Hazardous Waste Landfills and Their Correlation with Racial and Economic Status of Surrounding Communities. And this report revealed what? That three-quarters of the hazardous waste landfill sites in 8 southeastern states were located in primarily low income Black and Latin communities. So it was a clear case of disproportionate impact on the basis of class and race. Another very important report in this context came in 1987. The report was titled as Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. And this report was given by the Commission for Racial Justice. This report uncovered that in the US, race was the most important factor in determining where to place toxic waste facilities. In 1990, another very important work came in this context, that was Robert Bullard's work, Dumping in Dixie, Race, Class, and Environmental Quality. And this work informed that around 75% of landfills were located in communities where African Americans made up at least 26% of the population and whose family incomes were below the poverty level. So, once again, the same thing, class and race. So, this was clearly a case of environmental racialism, and the Black activists started saying that if we need to have environmental justice, we should develop policies which should be free from environmental racism and environmental inequality. And Benjamin Chavis defined environmental racism. We had seen this definition earlier also, where he says environmental racism is what? Racial discrimination in environmental policy making, the enforcement of regulations and laws, the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, and the history of excluding people of color from leadership of the ecology movements. So, this one incidence of Warren County, you see, made it very visible that how the impact of environmental degradation is shaped by one's uh, class as well as one's race. So, if we talk about what was the impact of Warren County movement, so one thing which is very clear that it made this hidden relation open. In terms of immediate achievement, we may say that it was not successful. Why? Because despite all furious protests, the landfill was placed in Warren County and it remained there for 21 years and finally got closed in 2003 after cleanup efforts that cost $18 million. Dolly Burwell appreciates the role of community when she says that the government can make a mistake just like an individual and come back and make up for that mistake with the right pressure from communities. So in this case, we can observe one thing, that Black community could create that right pressure. So though the protest could not get success in getting the PCP landfill closed in 1982, but actually, you see, it paved the way for historic shift in environmental policies and also in the approach of the mainstream environmental organization in the long run. So, when we talk about its impact, we can assess it basically at 3 levels. First, the awareness which is created among the affected communities. It made them realize that what kind of facilities are there in your surrounding. You need to be very critical when you are assessing those facilities, whether it is a green park or whether it is a business complex or whether it is a toxic waste landfill. So it made the community aware. Second very important impact was that it transformed mainstream environmental discourse and also led to change in environmental policies. So we'll see that what kind of change it brought in the environmental discourse. You see, when this movement was launched, for a long time, the mainstream environmental group, they did not pay attention to it, and therefore these activists who were involved in environmental justice movement, they co-signed a letter to the big 10 environmental groups, and they blamed that the mainstream environmental movement and organization, they are working with a kind of racial approach, and they are overlooking the issue of environmental justice. Because of this, ultimately in response, some of the mainstream environmental organization started making effort inclusion of environmental justice concern in their agenda. And in terms of policy impact, you see, it had immense policy impact. Why? Because in 1990, Environmental Equity Work Group was created by the US Environmental Protection Agency. Then in 1991, the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit held in Washington, D.C., and which was joined by environmental justice leaders and activists from around the world. And it also gave them a kind of opportunity for networking and collaboration. This summit produced two landmark documents: Call for Action and Principles of Justice. And it gave broad 17 principles of environmental justice with the prime goals of protection of all inhabitants of the ecosphere, sustainable future for all, and universal protection from nuclear testing, production, and disposal of toxic hazardous wastes and poisons. The biggest achievement of the movement can be seen in 1994 when President Bill Clinton signed executive order where the federal agencies were directed to identify and address disparities in the environmental and health impact of their policies on the marginalized communities and groups. So they were asked to identify the cases where there are disparities in the environmental and health impact of their policies, and at the same time to find out remedial measures for the same. So we can say that a protest that suffered an initial failure finally succeeded in creating long-term impact on the environmental policy and discourse, not only in the US but throughout the globe. So the journey that started in 1980s, we can say it is still continue. Why? Because there are a number of environmental groups who are working on environmental protection, and now they are talking about an agenda of environmental protection that is inclusive of environmental justice. So this was the, you see, environmental justice movement, and through this we could understand that how race and class shapes one's experience of environmental degradation. Now we'll talk about another movement, that is green belt movement, which would help us to understand this intersection of gender and class. So the green belt movement, which started in Kenya, uh, it somehow uh, sees the thing or experiences of women from the intersectional perspective. The gender and development framework highlights the disproportionate impact of modernization on women, especially rural women. So, rural women's dependence on natural resources for performance of daily tasks make them more vulnerable to the effects of resource scarcity that emanate from environmental degradation caused by modernization. So we need to understand that this modernization, which is often uh, based on anthropocentric perspective and negatively impacts environment. So this leads to a kind of depletion of resources. This depletion of resources impact everyone, but it impact those communities or those group of population more severely who are more dependent on natural resources. And in this case, we can say rural women have a kind of dependence on natural resources. Why? Because the division of labor, which is created by the society, that assign those works like fetching water, making arrangement for fuel. So all these works make them more dependent on natural resources. So obviously, its depletion has a different kind of impact on women. And Green Belt movement led by Professor Wangari Maathai was founded in Nairobi, Kenya in 1977. Actually, it highlighted and addressed this unequal impact of environmental degradation on women, especially on the rural Kenyan women. So, a case of intersection of gender, locality, and class. These women are deprived, they are facing spatial consequences of environmental degradation because of their gender. Second, because they are rural population, and also because of class. So, by integrating GAD framework and intersectionality, Green Belt movement fosters social change while addressing both gender inequalities and environmental issues. If we try to understand this root of Green Belt movement, we need to go back, and what we can see that the colonialism and environmental degradation in Kenya has a close relation. And it is true, you see, about most of the colonized nation, not only about Kenya. So before colonization in Kenya, indigenous communities used to manage forests through communal, sustainable practices. But what happened with advent of British colonial rule? It disrupted these systems and introduced centralized land ownership, commercial cultivation, and strict conservation policies. And all these were aimed at only favoring colonial interest. So, this way, British colonial land and agrarian policies laid the groundwork for environmental degradation and land grabbing and impacting post colonial modernization. So, these colonial policies actually neglected women's traditional land rights and their agricultural knowledge. Why? Because now they were talking about scientific knowledge of forestry. And by this, they increased their vulnerability to land dispossession and environmental consequences. What is more pathetic to observe that this situation continued even after independence. So the post colonial Kenya almost continued with the same kind of economic and political system, with the difference that earlier it was benefiting the colonial rulers, now it was benefiting the elites. This led to, on the one hand, marginalization of women and local communities, and on the other hand, environmental degradation that could seen in the decline of Kenya's forest cover. So deforestation has led to severe consequences and it disrupted the whole ecosystem. And as I said in the beginning also, that the rural women in Kenya actually were majorly impacted by these changes. On the one hand, they faced food insecurity. On the other, their working hours also increased. Why? Because they now had to walk further and further to get firewood for fuel and fencing. So, GBM, that is Green Belt Movement, challenges these colonial legacies by promoting grassroots afforestation efforts and empowering rural women. And basically, it aims to restore traditional ecological practices. So, the major strategies adopted by GBM are: first, democratizing forest management. So the movement aims at decentralizing environmental preservation, engaging local communities rather than relying on a bureaucratic colonial style government. So it wants that more and more role should be given to the local community in environmental preservation. And by empowering rural women to plant and maintain trees, it basically subverts colonial patriarchal power structure and also embodies the grassroots approach advocated by green and post colonial theorists. It also emphasizes on decolonization of environmental attitude. It argued that we need to replace that colonial anthropocentric perspective with ecocentric perspective. And for doing that, it tried to make the communities understand that there is a direct link between environmental health and their livelihood. So if they want improvement in their material condition, they need to work hard for environmental upgradation. It also addressed hyper modernization, which often disregarded the traditional roles and rights of women in rural communities. Now, you see, for doing all this, it basically needed a kind of transformation in the mindset. It had to do what kind of work to transform the victims into agency of change. And for that, education became very, very important tool in the green belt movement. The movement provided seminars focusing on civic and environmental education to help communities understand their challenges related to food, water, and firewood security. It made them realize that their well being is related to the well being of the environment, and most importantly, it made women realize their capacities. So, a notable case of GBM was the 1989 protest. There are a number of campaigns launched by GBM, but I'm referring to one very important case. That was its protest against skyscraper project in Nairobi's Uhuru Park. In this case, what happened? This park was a green park, and government decided that they it will construct a business complex in the park. So it was opposed by GPM on two grounds. Firstly, they argued that it is a government encroachment on public land, and second, it said that government wants to construct a business complex in a park that is a mark of government's anti-environmental policy. Now, the GBM launched lobbying and letter writing campaigns to various stakeholders. They also used international media for creating pressure. And finally, because of this aggressive activism, ultimately the project got cancelled. So, you see, it speaks that what kind of change GBM brought in the capacity of women in the local community. Now, we'll quickly talk about the impact of the movement. So we'll see how did it impact on environment and on women. So by encouraging communities to plant trees, the movement restores degraded land, increases biodiversity, and also mitigates climate change. It also brings for economic benefits and improves food security and increases crop production. In terms of its impact on women empowerment, it was a great success. It recognized the crucial role of women in environmental conservation and actively involves them in its activities. So now the training which are and the resources which are provided to women, that also led to broader change in their perspective and capacity. They started working as agents of change in their community, and in fact, it transformed them into active participants, not only in environmental conservation, but in political discourse and community development. In fact, it produced a new generation of educated women who were confident enough in asserting their rights and ready to make uh, changes and take up their responsibilities. Despite all hardship these women face, they showcased their resilience and determination. So, this way, we can say that through its multifaceted approach of combining education, advocacy, and direct action, the GBM has significantly impacted women's role in Kenyan society while addressing critical environmental issues. So, here through this green belt movement, we could understand that how gender, class intersects, it creates a different kind of experiences of marginalization and as well as activism. So, these are the references that I have used in this lecture. You can go through that, and these are the activity questions which you are expected to complete after listening the lecture. So, thank you, learners. In this lecture, we have tried to understand that how race, gender, class, and such social categories shape one's experience of environmental degradation. And we have tried to understand this intersectionality with the help of two major movements, that is environmental justice movement in America and the green belt movement in Kenya. So thank you so much for joining. Now we'll meet in the week 4.